Thank you very much, Scott. Thank you to everybody who came along to the June version of this, only to have technical problems mean it didn't happen. So on the bright side, it means I'm actually able to cover the entire state of emergency in the Isle of Man. It was a couple of weeks short of ending when I was originally going to give my paper. So fingers crossed. This is where it all went wrong, horribly wrong last time. Let's hope it doesn't this time. Right, reassure me you can see a PowerPoint on the screen.
It's coming up. Your presentation is coming up.
Brilliant.
Yep, we can see it.
I can see. Yeah, I can see it now. Excellent. So just very briefly, the Isle of Man is a small democracy, population around about 80,000. It's an island roughly equidistant from England, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, Northern Ireland in the Irish Sea. And it's been associated in one way or another with the British Crown since really 1376. So I'll talk a bit more about its constitutional nature a little later. What I'm going to do today, I hope, is talk about the emergency powers which were used to deal with the crisis in the Isle of Man during this recent pandemic. Talk in some detail about the emergency powers regulations, a very substantial body of regulations produced at great speed in the Isle of Man, and then take a step back from that to think about how the emergency powers situation has been created and shaped, if you like, by the particular characteristics of being a small island democracy. And I'm going to focus on capacity, intimacy, insularity, and dependency. So, what was the basis for the emergency powers in the Isle of Man during the pandemic? The Emergency Powers Act 1936, an act of Tynwald, which was slightly amended during the pandemic in 2020, is the legal foundation for the state of emergency. There was a little bit of confusion early on. The Chief Minister, the equivalent of the UK Prime Minister, said that this was the first use of emergency powers since World War II. Tynwald debates in 1988 indicate the act had never been used, and I've not been able to find any evidence that it was used. So how do we square this circle? Well, there were undoubtedly emergency powers used during World War II, starting from 1940 onwards, but they were actually powers under an imperial act, so an act of the UK Parliament as sort of the overlord of the Isle of Man. And they weren't actually used to the Emergency Powers Act 1936. So the Chief Minister is quite right to say these were the first use of emergency powers, but that's been understood to mean first use of the 1936 Act, and in fact it hadn't been used. So that's the way we square that circle. And squaring that circle, I think, shows two things. The 2020 crisis was the first state of emergency, other than those dealt with as public health crises, to be nationalised rather than imperial. And so by that I mean dealt with by Manx organs of government under Manx law, rather than a broader imperial or sort of whole British Island sort of approach. And in particular, the 2020 crisis was the first state of emergency led by a government responsible to Tynwald. Now, Tynwald is roughly equivalent to the Houses of Parliament. It's a bicameral chamber of around about 32 members, and it is the centre of the entire government system in the Isle of Man. In particular, it's dominated by democratically elected members, so it's very important that the current crisis was dealt with by a government responsible to a democratically elected chamber. The use of emergency powers begins with a proclamation by the Governor in Council, which, again, analogously to the UK, actually means the government. It's the Governor advised in a binding sense by the Council of Ministers. This isn't confirmed by anybody, it's simply made an action of the executive, and the declaration was made on the 16th of March. The most important thing a proclamation does is it activates the power to make emergency power regulations, EPRs. Unusually, these are valid immediately. They do not need to be approved by the legislature, but they must be laid before Tynwald in 7 days. And if they aren't approved at that point, they cease to have effect after a further 7 days. The proclamation only lasts a month, but it may be renewed. And in this crisis, it was repeatedly renewed until the 26th of June. EPRs expire at the end of each proclamation period, so each month, unless they're reapproved by Tynwald. And in fact, they were reapproved by Tynwald throughout the emergency. The emergency came to an end, and the EPRs did not completely disappear. A number of EPRs were continued for up to 6 months under what's called a continuation EPR, and I'll come back to that a little later. So, the effect of declaring the state of emergency was that the executive government was empowered to make these emergency powers regulations, and these had very, very broad sweep. They were used very broadly. They cover a very wide range of subjects, and I'll break them down a little bit later in this presentation, which together really constitute an unprecedented intervention across Manx life. If you're aware of the Manx state of emergency at all, it may be through the UK press, which really pointed out how serious some of the penalties imposed by the Isle of Man were for violations of the EPRs. There's a link on this slide to the text of each regulation, and additionally, as each regulation came out throughout the emergency, I did a blog on it, so there's sort of an analysis and a gloss of each regulation. Next few slides are going to involve some numbers, but as the lawyers will know, numbers don't tell you a tremendous amount about law. So can I just check before I go any further if I can pull up the right screen? I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. Has everybody been able to see and hear what I've been saying so far? Fantastic, because last time I was Scott will recall, I happily whipped on for 5 minutes, entirely oblivious to the fact that nobody else could hear me. So I shall go back, I hope, to those slides. Okay, looks like it's about to go back up again. Brilliant. So, as you can see, the number of regulations front-loaded. As the crisis begins and as government realises what needs to be done to reduce the spread and to deal with some other issues, we have a rapid ramp-up in the number of regulations created. There was a single regulation in the week of the 15th of March, the week that the emergency started, then a very busy week in the 22nd of May, and then as you can see from the bar, we see a gradual dropping throughout the emergency of the number of regulations created each week. Interestingly, I think, as you might expect, at the start of the emergency, the EPRs are dealing with new issues, creating new laws, and as the emergency goes on, you find more and more are actually amending EPRs. So they take an existing EPR and they make a change to it. Now, some of these changes were substantive changes to policy. As attitudes towards exercise, for instance, change, you see amendments to the rules on exercise. But quite a lot of them are actually fixing drafting problems in the earlier EPRs. And these were sometimes ones which were identified even before Tynwald had approved the regulation. And I'll come back to talk about that. So you'll see on the first slide, gradually we start to see more amending EPRs. And then really when we get towards the second half of the emergency, pretty much every EPR is making an amendment to the existing regime. So the regime becomes very inward looking and is sort of tinkering and fine tuning and correcting as it goes. As I've said, the EPRs need to be approved by Tynwald. And as you would expect, we see a jump up a week after the regulation is passed. Remember, the regulation has to come to Tynwald within 7 days or it ceases to have effect. So things get quieter as we go on. This, I think, is interesting. At the start of the crisis, although Tynwald had the power to amend regulations, and remember there's a lot of regulations going through at the start, he didn't exercise it. But then gradually we see Tynwald begin to take what government has produced, which has been law for a week, and make changes to it as it goes through the approval process. We also have a situation where the government would sometimes choose not to lay an EPR before Tynwald, either because it was no longer necessary. For instance, it had made a change and then another EPR had quickly been passed to correct it, or there was a feeling that it would not command the support of Tynwald. So an EPR not being laid before Tynwald rather than risk a defeat in the legislative chamber. And if you look at the bottom graph there, that shows you the number of EPRs each week that were laid rather than put for approval before Tynwald. And we see quite a big spike towards the end of the emergency. Similarly, towards the end of the emergency, we see a number of EPRs lost. So these are EPRs that have been put before Tynwald for approval, had failed to secure approval, so a vote had been called and the government had lost that vote. And as a result, it ceased to be of effect. And you can see that that doesn't happen at all for most of the crisis, but then as we get towards the end of the pandemic period, we start to see this happen. I'll come back to the importance of that in a moment. Very quickly, what sort of things did the EPRs cover? Movement was very, very important. So internal movement, restrictions, imposition of social distancing, things like that. Closures of businesses, education institutions, administration, making the process by which the Isle of Man public sector in particular functioned more efficient, making things easier when you couldn't witness wills, stuff like that. Border control, very important point I'll come to in a moment. And then the others are relatively less important. So let's do a quick bit of analysis of that. A lot of the analysis of the Manx response to the pandemic is going to be the same as for any other country. You know, you have a democracy which is looking at exceptional control of citizens, exceptional intervention in the economy. Things like the blurring between guidance and law is going to be relevant there. But smallness and insularity is important too. I think the first thing I'd draw is capacity. This was the first national emergency dealt with nationally, so Manx resources were drawn on for drafting. A Manx law is no quicker to draft than a UK law, and you have a very small team who would deal with a relatively small amount of work at any given period. And as you could see from my slides on the volume of EPRs at the start, they had a massive number of laws to draft. The Chief Minister on the 31st of March said, I've got my team working 100 hours a week at the moment. That is what we've had to do over the last number of weeks to get ourselves in the position where we are. They did an incredible job. The Attorney General's team and Tynwald support staff really pulled a blinder. But I think the sheer volume of work they had to do means that there were quite a significant number of problems with drafting. And some of them are really, really patent. For instance, an EPR which makes specific amendments to an act without ever specifying what that act is, and I could give various others. So what you actually found was that having got to a position where errors were being made, the team were quite quick in dealing with them. So you had correctly EPR sometimes coming out in less than 24 hours. You had amendments put into Tynwald as the EPR went through. You had instances when a person in Tynwald would say, look, this EPR doesn't make sense, you need to fix it. And they would promise to vote in favour of it as long as there was a correction fairly shortly after. Intimacy, very small number of people responsible for policy and scrutiny in the Isle of Man. As I said, Tynwald's about 32. One goal of the government was a substantial element of consensus, and the Chief Minister on 31st of March used one of his more favourite phrases, this is how we work as a team, Team Tynwald. This intimacy had some definite advantages. So moving debates of Tynwald, which had to happen every week for the EPRs, moving them online was comparatively easy and didn't have anything like the democratic problems which we find in relation to the Houses of Parliament. But this intimacy, I think, was in tension with formality. And I think sometimes there wasn't recognition that lawmaking needed to be so formal. You had laws creating criminal offences coming out with immediate effect at 7 o'clock on a Sunday evening and not actually being available publicly until the next day, for instance. And so I think formality was perhaps lost a little bit as everyone saw themselves in this together under exceptional circumstances. Additionally, consensus may be in tension with scrutiny, and I think there was a real balancing shifting over time in relation to Tynwald here. The shift in balance is fairly gradual, but I think the tipping point was probably the week of the 17th of May. It was the first EPR to be lost. It was not a particularly pivotal EPR. It was actually about planning appeals processes, but it was lost. And a member of the government, Chris Thomas, who was a minister, voted against the EPR and lost his ministerial job for failing to support it. That itself is contentious. I'll save that for another day. Later, hugely important EPRs, in particular one that would have delegated the power to create criminal offences across the regulatory board during the emergency, were withdrawn from consideration because the Council of Ministers did not anticipate support for it. And there was very much a feel that Tynwald had had enough of the emergency, that it was time to wind down the EPRs and time to get ready to move on to the next phase. So the Isle of Man is actually coronavirus free at the moment, and the next phase really is primarily border control, but there are a few other bits left over. So I think intimacy is very important in understanding the tension between consensus and scrutiny in this process. Insularity was key. The Isle of Man closed borders to everyone, except instrumental exceptions, for instance, people required to do health work, people going to the Isle of Man, UK for healthcare. On the 23rd of March, the position of Manx residents stranded abroad, typically but not always in the UK, was a major political controversy and probably the hottest potato during the crisis. The system for allowing residents to return was initially very secure and expensive, and the plan was for that cost to be borne by the returning person, and then it was switched to self-isolation. Non-residents were barred, including for compassionate grounds, but eased up for attending family funerals later, and more grounds for travel have been created. Border controls are still in place. For instance, I can't go to the Isle of Man, and at the moment they look set to be retained for up to 6 months. And of course, there may be primary legislation pushing it beyond that. So the Isle of Man as a jurisdiction, which is also an island, is really important to understanding the response. The last thing I want to bring out is the Isle of Man's Crown dependency. As a result, the governor retains a role. The governor is representative of the Queen. In particular, people have questioned his being involved in the Emergency Powers Declaration. When this was considered back in the 2000s, the reason he kept in that place was because of his link to the UK military. He is the person who calls in the UK military if needed. Because the Queen ultimately assents to all Manx legislation, her assent was needed to change in the EPA mid-crisis. But it was certainly striking to me how much decision-making was Manx and how comparatively little seemed to involve the UK. And the experience of Guernsey and Jersey, I think, would mirror that. Nearly done. But because it has been a Crown dependency, it has a special de facto link to the UK. It's the first port of call for outsourced expertise or capacity, and that's gone both ways and needs to be taken account of in the EPRs. So, to conclude, first national emergency in the Isle of Man. Responses, the EPR system has been shaped by the Isle of Man being a small island democracy. There is dissatisfaction with the 1936 Act and a desire to create a new emergencies regime. There's a lot to be learned from what happened since March. There's also a lot to be learned from the history of the EPA in the Isle of Man, which can be traced back to 1919. And I would say that any new regime needs to take very seriously the analytical frames of smallness, insularity, and democracy. It's important that the Isle of Man is a small island democracy. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Peter, for